Before we get started, can I ask you for a small favor? If you have found any value in this podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps spread the word even further and means so much to me to have your support. Welcome to another episode of Codebreakers, the podcast that empowers you to overcome life's challenges and tap into your full potential. I'm Sam, your host. Okay, it's story time. We're diving into what it's like healing from complex PTSD while navigating corporate America. So, if you're interested in a little bit of the drama that has been my life for the last 9 to 10 years, stay tuned. First of all, let's talk briefly about what complex PTSD is and how it typically manifests. C-PTSD is a condition that can develop after prolonged exposure to traumatic events, often involving interpersonal trauma and abuse, like neglect, betrayal, bullying, discrimination, domestic violence, etc. Unlike traditional PTSD, which is usually linked to a single traumatic incident, complex PTSD is associated with ongoing repetitive trauma. And this is typically characterized by long term emotional and psychological consequences that result from those traumatic events, mostly, again, within relationships. Prolonged exposure can lead to neurobiological changes affecting parts of the brain responsible for our emotional regulation, our memory, and our body's stress responses. So, if you're interested in going more in depth on that specifically, definitely check out episode 3, The Science Behind Trauma, Recovery, and Growth. Knowing that CPTSD is related to interpersonal trauma, it makes me think that on the one hand, there's an obvious difference between complex trauma and regular life trauma. But on the other, it's fascinating to draw similarities and say, look, even though my life was messed up, other people deal with similar shit too. And while my exposure and responses might be considered on the extreme end, a lot of the feelings and struggles that come along with dealing with and healing from complex trauma are just exasperated symptoms of the regular pain and disappointments of life. This makes me think about how important our foundational experiences are during those first few years of life. It's during this time that the groundwork for our emotional and psychological well being is laid. Attachment theory comes into play here, which highlights the serious impact that early relationships have on our emotional development. Secure attachments formed through consistent and responsive caregiving give people a sturdy foundation for their future relationships and emotional well being. While the opposite, disruptions or inconsistencies in our earliest relationships and some of our most formative bonds, actually increase the likelihood that we'll struggle with regulating our emotions and forming healthy connections later in life. Fun stuff. The brain, especially during these formative years, is incredibly malleable and adaptive. It constantly rewires itself based on the experiences that it's encountering, and over time begins to solidify beliefs and thought patterns and perceptions as our neural pathways develop and solidify. And the environment and the context of the relationships in which this is occurring can have a major impact on someone's memory, their relationships, or their ability to self regulate. This is why that foundation is so important. When you have a healthy foundation to start from, and when your experience with relational trauma doesn't involve your fundamental relationships, like with your parents, later in life with your spouses, you are inherently better positioned and equipped to navigate the typical stressors of life that are inevitably going to arise. So, while my journey with complex PTSD involves what may seem like extreme responses, I do think that it's crucial to recognize the continuum of the human experience. Drawing parallels between the struggles of people with PTSD and complex PTSD and the more common pains of life only emphasize the importance of empathy and understanding. We all navigate challenges throughout life, and acknowledging the impact of our foundational experiences really allows us to appreciate the shared aspects of our humanity. And with compassion for one another, we can collaboratively build resilience and foster growth as we navigate life and leadership. Understanding and addressing interpersonal trauma is crucial for people seeking healing and recovery. But most of us have to work, we have bills to pay and life to live, and that can make it really difficult to even think about prioritizing this aspect of your health and wellness. It feels scary, it feels overwhelming, and it feels easier to ignore. It's generally invisible how we're feeling on the inside anyway, right? We can put a smile on our face and answer good when someone asks how we're doing, but the weight and the burden of unresolved fear, pain, disappointment, it doesn't just disappear. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you can't ignore it forever. It'll come up eventually, whether it shows up as explosive anger at seemingly small things, infidelity, perfectionism, people pleasing, workaholism, or in your body as disease, dis-ease. My point is that you aren't alone, and it is possible to confront difficult or painful topics, which will ultimately free you in a whole new way to be who you truly are and live a beautiful, healthy, full, aligned life. You can you can deal with shit and live life in the process. Is it easy? Absolutely not. Is it worth it? Absolutely yes. The corporate world can be unforgiving, demanding, it's fast paced, stressful, and for those on a healing journey of any type, but especially PTSD and complex trauma survivors like myself, I speak from experience when I say that it can be a constant battle to balance self care and professional responsibilities and life on top of that. Research in neuropsychology shows that chronic stress can exacerbate complex PTSD symptoms, making the workplace a legitimate hazard. But like most workplace hazards, it can be mitigated, reduced, and even eliminated. I've been with Amazon for about 9.5 years, where I'm currently a senior manager. Prior to that, I was a single mom. I worked for a logistics company during the day while taking classes at night through my local state university to get my undergraduate degree. I started my current career with Amazon immediately after finishing my degree in 2014 and have been on a solid upward trajectory ever since. I started in fulfillment centers, which was very fast paced and demanding, but I loved it because I got to lead large teams right away. We had clear goals, and it was easy to recognize whether we won or lost at the end of the day. After promoting a couple of times, I decided I wanted to try my hand in the corporate world. And I really believed that it would allow me to cultivate a whole new skill set while also providing a little bit more flexibility than the warehouse world, which can be especially important when you're on your own. My first corporate role was a mixture of operations management and program management, a perfect blend of something I knew really well and an area I knew I could develop in. I loved this role, this team, and this experience up until about halfway through it. I started to recognize some unethical behavior and statements. I started asking more questions, and eventually that all came to a head around the same time that I had the flashback I mentioned in episode 4. By now, this is 2017, 2018 timeframe, and let me provide some quick context here. 2017 is when I started therapy, started looking for a therapist because I knew I had a colorful childhood and I was progressing through my career. But some of the feedback I was getting, some conversations with my now husband while we were in our early dating stages, I started to realize that I had spent all my time up to that point surviving. So much so that I never really learned how to live, how to get close to people and allow them to get close to me. I had a surface level understanding that while I seemed to make it out alive, everything I had gone through was affecting me in other more nuanced ways that I didn't fully understand. And I really wanted an independent third party opinion and perspective on what I was going through, how I was feeling, and why I might see and feel things the way that I do. So I start therapy, and she's like, yeah, your life was pretty fucked up in a way nicer way. She was truly the sweetest woman and exactly what I needed at the time. But she said, "Look, it's not recognized in the DSM, the holy bible of mental health diagnoses in the US, but it is gaining traction as a recognized disorder." And I still hate that terminology today. But anyways, she was like, "Yeah, so this is probably what you've got going on." And she was honest with me that I was going to have a lot of work ahead of me, but she also made me believe that healing was possible and that I could live a very happy, full life despite all I had been through and despite what it felt like at the time. So we did traditional talk therapy. She gave me tools to manage my stress, and I started EMDR. If you caught that episode, you know that after just a couple sessions, I stopped because I had that flashback that just rocked me. Now, let me paint the picture for you. I'm in my mid to late 20s. I've always had a gut instinct that something was wrong. I knew my life was a shit show, but I just always kind of knew there was more to the story than what I could consciously recall. Something within me just said there's more. And that flashback proved that. All of a sudden, I knew that what I thought happened did happen, and my healing journey kind of shifted from how do I get better at managing my stress response, my emotional regulation, and my relationships to what the fuck actually happened and why has everyone been lying about it for so long? My family and I, ended up moving in late December 2018. I'm still working for Amazon at this time. I kind of wrote off therapy, not expecting to be there for very long and not wanting to start over, only to start over when we planned on moving again. 0 out of 10. Do not recommend. I'm kidding, kinda. Anyways, instead of consistent therapy, during this time, I got really deep into meditation. I would meditate for 20 to 30 minutes a day easily. And you can ask my husband. I'm sure there were days where I would sit by the pool or in my meditation room slash gym and just meditate and journal for hours. Again, still working for Amazon through all this. Now we're into 2019, and this is about the time that I started to have physical manifestations of my trauma. I experienced chronic undiagnosed pain for months, almost maybe a year, maybe longer. But I went through that for a long time before receiving a diagnosis and a treatment plan for what ended up being endometriosis, adenomyosis, and pelvic floor dysfunction, which ended up leading to a total hysterectomy in February of 2020 at the age of 29. And wow. And that brought on a whole new range of, wow, I'm getting emotional. I didn't expect that. And that brought on a whole new range of emotions and thoughts and beliefs and shame and sadness that I had to address on top of my still unresolved childhood trauma, all while working at Amazon and putting on a face as if everything was okay. So just like I'm gonna do now, back then, I just kept going. I only took a few weeks off of work to recover from surgery, and I just kept trying to go on with life. And I think therein lies the problem, right? It's a huge risk. But with the right guidance and support, I think this is 100% possible. Without a strong support system, oh gosh, it's not impossible, nothing is, but it is exponentially more challenging. So, my advice when you think about embarking on your healing journey, mitigate your risk to additional trauma or additional harm by taking some time to assess your environment and the people you're surrounding yourself with. And if something isn't working, make a plan to moderate exposure or remove it from your life entirely while you prioritize your healing and your peace. So then, early 2020 to now can be summarized pretty succinctly. I have been knee deep in my healing journey, meditation, therapy, somatic release, taking intentional steps to align my life in a way that supports my dreams, my aspirations, my purpose, and my health. The hysterectomy, the pandemic, they both did a number on me, probably thanks to complex trauma. And I still didn't have answers to that flashback, which was consuming a lot of my attention and bandwidth. We ended up moving again in December of 2020. And as a last ditch effort to get some answers, around that same time, I sent in a formal request to the state to receive my records from DCS or whatever. And this was the first time I really started to feel like I couldn't handle the pressures of work and life. I was under an immense amount of stress at work. Moving is obviously stressful. I had all this stuff going on in my personal life that was just eating away at my soul. So, for the first time ever, I think around May 2021, I told my boss at the time that I had complex PTSD and I was having a really hard time with everything. They responded from such a personal level, and work wasn't what mattered anymore. I felt supported, like they had my back, and that we could work through a solution together to protect the team, the business, and me, which was all I wanted and all I could ask for. I wasn't anticipating the weight of what would happen next. In June 2021, I received the paperwork from the state and I couldn't even open it at first. I was working, barely kind of maintaining any sort of balance or shred of my mental health. And here's a 60 plus page report from the state that may or may not give me what I'm looking for and what I need to get just a little bit of closure. Eventually, I opened it about a month later, and I did. I got enough for everything to make sense. I got enough to trust myself again. The reality, though, was that the whole time I was going through this, from that first therapy office visit in 2017 to now, and honestly, if I think about it for a lot longer than that, I was just trying to numb through working and keeping myself distracted, which still to this day is why I'm so task focused, I'm sure. When I was working, I wanted to excel, but when I wasn't, my mind was almost constantly focused on my healing process. What happened? Why? Was I ever going to get any answers? I worked, so I wouldn't think about it. And when I wasn't working, it was all I could think about. And then eventually, even while I was working, it was all I could think about. And because I was so consumed with this outside of work, it affected how I showed up at work. I learned that showing up physically, mentally, and emotionally are very different things. I know we've all heard the statistics about workplace engagement, but has anyone asked what's happening outside of the workplace that might affect this? Have you ever paused to consider that? My point is that my level of engagement was significantly impacted because of what I had going on in my own life. And I can't be the only one. I refuse to believe that. But we don't seem to be talking about how leaders, peers, colleagues, or even our friends and family can recognize and respond when someone's struggling like this. Maybe not to the extent I was. Maybe they're just a little too stressed, a little too overworked, or, maybe we know when someone gets into a bad car wreck, and that's easy to respond to. But what about when they or someone they know and love gets a cancer diagnosis, or they're going through a shitty divorce? How do we create environments that recognize that and can intelligently respond without causing more harm? How can we respond and be more empathetic without making them divulge what they're going through? How might people heal differently, maybe even more efficiently if our society and leaders within our society approached the lack of workplace engagement from a more holistic perspective? While staying distracted works for a lot of us for a long time, it's really no way to live. You're missing out on so much more depth to the experience of life. And while some people are perfectly content with that, that's fine if that's you and that's what you want. But if not, then congrats. You've chosen the path less traveled and you're in for a wild ride. But I promise you, it is so much more enjoyable and liberating than the alternative. Although we're making progress, the stigma surrounding mental health in the workplace does still exist, and it can lead to additional stress and challenges that prevent people from seeking the support that they need. But please don't feel bad about prioritizing your mental health and your physical and emotional well being. Here are a few things that should be available to you and will help you tremendously in navigating what you're going through. Establish clear boundaries between your work life and your personal life. Prioritize self care and stress management. Meditate, journal, make sure you're grounding and exercising and eating healthy. I know all of this is stuff you've probably heard before, but that's because it works and it does make a difference. Connect with friends and colleagues who may have experienced similar challenges, or you can simply trust to hold that space for you. If possible, have an open dialogue with your employer or HR department about your needs, any support available to you that you may not already be aware of, and potential accommodations if that's a path that you're interested in exploring as well. And as always, seek support. Therapy can provide you with essential tools and coping mechanisms, but if that's not an option for you, intentionally follow some social media accounts that specialize in the type of therapy you're most interested in. Above all else, be intentional and never give up. Give yourself grace to stumble. 2 steps forward and 1 step back is still 1 step forward. So keep trying until you figure out what works for you and be kind to yourself in the process. So there's a little bit about my journey. Next week's episode will be a bit of a continuation with some proposed tips for leaders and loved ones of PTSD and C-PTSD survivors. If you have any questions you want me to answer, send me a message and I might be able to include it. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a review. I so appreciate your support and wish you the best on your journey. Until next time, remember, you have the power to break your own code and rewrite your story. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you next time.